Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be back in Iceland. I'm going to talk about the issue of climate change, once again, from a different perspective. I have recently engaged in a collaboration with the editorial cartoonist of the Washington Post, Tom Toles. Tom, for years, has engaged in what I would describe as the hardest-hitting commentary on climate change and climate change denialism in the entire American print media, in our entire press. His editorials about climate change and climate change denial are really some of the strongest commentary that we can find today on the issue of climate change. And so he and I decided to engage in a project where we would use his cartoons, the cartoons he's done over the years, and a number of new cartoons he's done exclusively for the book, which comes out in early September, just in time for the home stretch of the presidential campaign. We would use his cartoons to tell the story, with some text to support them, of course, but to use his cartoons to construct a narrative about the issue of climate change, taking us from the fundamental science, in fact, from philosophy of science. How does science work? What is the scientific evidence for climate change? What are the likely impacts of climate change? Why is it that we have found this issue so politicized? What is it that is behind the denial that continues today of climate change? And finally, what can we do to solve the problem? What is the path forward? Is there a path forward? So let me sort of walk you through the story as we tell it. The first point here is that science. Today, there are far too many who call themselves skeptics, okay? And they compare themselves to modern-day Galileos railing against the establishment when they're literally just cranks pretending to be Galileo, people up late typing away at the internet, absolutely certain that climate change is a hoax, and their belief that climate change is a hoax is based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. That is the furthest thing from skepticism. Good scientists are true skeptics. Skepticism means holding a proposition up to scrutiny from all directions. And the more, as Carl Sagan once said, the more extraordinary the scientific claim, the more extraordinary the evidence has to be, and the more intense our scrutiny has to be. That's true scientific skepticism, and it is practiced by scientists in publishing in the peer-reviewed literature, in the exchanges that take place at scientific meetings. But the sort of one-sided skepticism that involves rejecting consensus science based on the flimsiest of arguments that don't stand up to the slightest bit of logic, that's not skepticism. That's pseudo-skepticism, contrarianism, or in its most severe form, denial of established science. Science isn't litigated by talking heads on television screens debating two sides of the proposition. When it comes to matters like evolution, when it comes to matters like climate change, where there's an overwhelming consensus among the world's scientists about what the science has to say, the truth isn't halfway between the two extremes. That's where the abyss is. So, climate change, the basics. Okay, there is a very widespread consensus, anywhere from 97 to 99.9% of the scientific community. If you look at the actual published literature, you look at what actual scientists have to say, there's an overwhelming consensus among the world's scientists that climate change is real and human-caused. Now, the contrarians will say, oh, it's collusion. You're just all reinforcing the dominant narrative. It's not like all scientists stand in a circle and sing Kumbaya. In science, the way to get ahead is actually by proving the rest of the scientists wrong. The way you get an article in Nature or Science is by introducing something new and interesting and defying conventional wisdom. So the idea that scientists seek to reinforce the consensus to get more grant money or to publish prominent publications in Nature and Science gets it completely backwards. That's not at all the way science works. And the reason there's a consensus isn't just because all scientists have decided to agree with each other. It's because there are so many independent lines of evidence that all point in the same direction. So many lines of evidence that it's virtually impossible to find any explanation of how we could explain the warming of the globe and the changes in climate we're seeing without the human impact that we are having. And the science is really basic, and we've known about it for nearly 2 centuries. You put more CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to warm the surface. That is nearly 200-year-old basic chemistry, basic physics. And what we have been doing over the last 2 centuries has been refining our understanding of the details. And the details are interesting. And sometimes they're counterintuitive. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. So when it rains, you can potentially get larger amounts of rainfall or larger snowstorms. The Washington, D.C. blizzard that we had earlier this year was related to unusually warm sea surface temperatures off the east coast of the U.S. And a cold air mass collided with especially warm temperatures of the ocean, gave us record levels of moisture that produced record snowfall. That's actually predicted to happen because of global warming. So you get larger amounts of precipitation when you get rain and snow, but at the same time in many regions, in the subtropics and the mid-latitudes, the rainfall events become less frequent. You get more of it when it happens, but you get less of it in general. Drought becomes more widespread. So it is literally possible, and in fact not only possible, but probable, that we see in many regions greater flooding, but also worse drought, worse summer drought. And sea level rise, it doesn't get much simpler than this. You melt ice sheets, you melt glaciers, that water runs off into the ocean, sea level increases. You warm water, it expands. It's really basic physics. It contributes to sea level rise. Extreme weather events. There are increasingly is a fair amount of science pointing towards climate change being responsible for the increase in many types of extreme weather events. Droughts and floods, as I've mentioned, heat waves, hurricanes, stronger hurricanes. The science is pointing in that direction. And what you'll see very often from some of my scientist colleagues when they're asked by a journalist, was this event caused by climate change? And they'll lead with their uncertainty, because that's what scientists like to do. We don't like to tell you what we know. We actually like to tell you what we don't know, because that's what we spend our time doing, trying to figure out the answers to the things we don't know. So they'll say, well, you can never explain any one event. And they're providing a correct answer, a trivially correct answer to the wrong question, okay? The question isn't, can we relate any one weather event to climate change? That's no different from asking if we can relate any one death from lung cancer to the smoking of cigarettes. The relationship is statistical. People die of lung cancer anyways at times, but smoking increases the probability by 100-fold of getting lung cancer and dying from it. And so it is with climate change that it is making various types of extreme weather events more frequent and more intense. And arguing that, well, we can't really relate any one event to climate change per se is literally, as Tom says, a loophole you could lose a planet through. Tipping points. There are tipping points in the climate system. People often ask me, where's the tipping point? How much warming until we cross the tipping point? There isn't one tipping point. There are many tipping points, and some of them we've probably crossed. We've probably crossed the tipping point where we've warmed the planet enough to melt enough of the West Antarctic ice sheet that we will eventually get 10 to 14 feet of sea level rise from that alone. And there's nothing we can do to stop it. Even if we could magically cool the planet back down, we can't stop that from proceeding once it gets going. It's a tipping point-like response. The shutdown of the conveyor belt ocean circulation that helps moderate climate here in Iceland and other parts of the North Atlantic we think we're fairly close to a tipping point where that ocean circulation pattern either significantly weakens or collapses, and that would have profound regional impacts on climate, deleterious impacts on climate as well. The problem with tipping points is they are like mines in a minefield. We know they're out there, but we don't know exactly where they are. And the only safe thing to do is to not walk out onto the minefield, which is what we are doing with our profligate burning of fossil fuels. Why should we care? It isn't just because of polar bears and penguins, okay? They may symbolize the climate change threat, the climate crisis. And we do care about living things. And polar bears and penguins are actually symbolic of a much greater problem, which is that we are engaged in what increasingly we have to characterize as the 6th major extinction event in Earth's history. And the difference is that this extinction event isn't natural. We're causing it through various actions, including climate change. And the further we warm the planet, the more species that go extinct, and at a rate unlike anything that we have seen in the past. And we get massive wildfires, like have broken out in the western US in recent years, destroying large amounts of our forests, destroying houses. And we get sea level rise combining with stronger hurricanes, which gives you greater threats to our coastlines the world over. And 25% of the population of the world live within several hundred kilometers of the coastline. So what we're talking about is potentially displacing huge amounts of people. Less land available for human habitation, less fresh water as glaciers melt, as we get more evaporation from warming temperatures, less food as agricultural productivity declines with warming temperatures, and we have more damaging extreme weather events. And yes, when you get less water, less food, less resources for a growing global population, that's a problem. It's a problem for national security. It gives you greater conflict around the world, like the Syrian drought that arguably has had a very important role in the instability in the Middle East in recent years. And so there are critics who say, well, if we act on this problem, we're going to destroy the economy. Well, if we don't have a livable climate, we don't have an economy. And in fact, if you look at what economists who actually study this problem in detail are finding, they will tell you that the cost of inaction, of not acting on the problem right now, is far greater than the cost of taking action. And that only grows more true over time. And yes, it isn't just about science and politics and economics. It's about ethics. And Pope Francis, with his encyclical last year, has really helped to refocus this debate, where in my view it should be focused on the ethical dimensions of what we are doing to the planet with our continued burning of fossil fuels. Now, there is denial, widespread denial still today of climate change. And deniers, climate change deniers, tend to evolve over time. They're retreating as the evidence becomes stronger. Originally, the argument was there was no warming, and the latest version of that is that global warming has paused. Well, 2014 was the warmest year on record until 2015, which was the warmest year on record, warmer than 2014, until 2016, which is now warmer than either 2014 or 2015 and will likely be the new record temperature. So it's hard to find a pause there. The only pause has been in our taking action in the face of increasingly widespread and convincing evidence. Well, then the argument goes, all right, well, you know what? Maybe it's natural. Maybe the warming is natural. Well, no. We can actually look at that problem in many different ways. And when you look at what climate models tell us, they tell us that the globe probably should have been cooling over the last several decades if it were primarily natural factors that were at work. We cannot explain the warming from natural factors. We can only explain it from the ongoing burning of fossil fuels. Okay, well then the next retreat in sort of the stages of denial is, okay, well, maybe it's not natural, but maybe it's self-correcting. Maybe there are magical mechanisms that will prevent the warming from getting out of hand. Well, no. The geological record tells us distinctly otherwise. During the early Cretaceous period, CO2 concentrations were many times higher than they are today, and global temperatures were much higher than they are today, and there was no ice on the face of the Earth. Now, those natural changes take place over time scales of literally, that's 100 million years that it took for nature to finally bury all of that carbon that was in the atmosphere during the time of the dinosaurs, and eventually through natural processes bury it beneath the surface. What we are doing is unburying all of that carbon that nature buried over 100 million years, but we're putting it up into the atmosphere on a timescale of 100 years, 1 million times faster. There is no precedent in Earth history for the experiment that we are playing with the Earth. Well, then it goes, all right, well, maybe it's not natural, maybe there aren't self-correcting mechanisms, but maybe it'll be good for us. Well, no. We've looked very hard. Scientists have spent decades looking at the projected impacts of climate change on food, on water, on human health, on land availability, on national security, on the strength of our economy, and across the board, once we get beyond about 2 degrees Celsius warming, which we commit to if we don't act fairly quickly, we start to see many of the worst projected impacts of climate change. Well, then the final stage of denial is, well, you know what? It's too late to do anything about it anyway, so we'll just adapt to it. Well, no. Once warming gets beyond about 2 degrees Celsius, it's very difficult to see any strategies where we retain an adaptive capacity to deal with the changes that are underway. The war on climate science. So there has been this ongoing war on climate science, efforts to discredit the science of climate change, typically by fossil fuel interests and the front groups and the paid advocates that they hire, and the journalists in their pay and the politicians in their pay. And much like the last Japanese soldier still fighting World War II, climate change deniers will still be denying climate change, some of them decades from now. Literally, as the water levels come up above their heads, they will continue, the bubbles will come out of their mouth, they will continue to deny climate change. But hopefully the rest of us will move on. And where does this denial come from? Fossil fuel interests for decades have spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars creating front groups and think tanks, funding fake experts to create this massive echo chamber of climate change denialism in our media, in our public discourse, on the internet. And some of the same prominent scientists like Fred Singer, who were happily working for the tobacco industry decades ago, denying the impact of their product, are today working for the fossil fuel industry, denying the threat of climate change, an all-opportunity denier. And then you have people who play a scientist on television, like Steve Malloy. He's actually a tobacco and fossil fuel lobbyist. But on Fox News, he's a science expert who happily dismisses concerns about climate change and about just about any other environmental problem and engages in attacks against climate scientists and science writ large. And if all else fails, go after Al Gore. It's all about Al Gore. It's because Al Gore needs to lose weight. That's why climate change is a myth, apparently, goes the thinking. And we have individuals like Mark Morano, who was actually part of the original Swift boat attack. If you remember in the presidential campaign in the US between John Kerry and George W. Bush, where late in the campaign they got some of Kerry's fellow soldiers who had served in the war on a Swift boat, on a boat, to say all sorts of terrible things about him, to basically lie about him, to malign him, to smear him, and to try to take one of his strengths. He was a military hero who had received several awards for his military service, to try to turn that into a weakness in defeating him. Well, Mark Morano today is now working for fossil fuel interests, applying those same techniques to climate scientists. swift-boating climate scientists like myself, like Stefan Rahmstorf, and getting paid a pretty penny for doing so. Well, if you're looking for hypocrisy in modern society, look no further than climate change denial, where you have politicians who are literally burying their heads in the sand as sea levels encroach, denying that anything's happening, despite the growing evidence all around them. Whether it's North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida, where prominent Republicans have attempted to outlaw the prediction of sea level rise, or to outlaw the use of the term global warming or sea level rise. Sea level rise being, according to Virginia Republicans, a political term. What's that?
He said a left-wing term.
A left-wing term. I apologize. Nothing so neutral as a political term. So, and that's why you have politicians like Ken Cuccinelli, who was the former Attorney General of Virginia, who tried to use a civil subpoena to demand all of my personal emails to discredit me and the science of climate change and the hockey stick curve that I published. And by the way, Cuccinelli did get a lot of money from fossil fuel interests for his campaigns. And then, of course, Senator Snowball James Inhofe, who has described climate change as the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. And as evidence of that hoax, he has introduced a snowball on the Senate floor of the US Senate. And then there are media moguls like Rupert Murdoch, who control a powerful international media empire, News Corp. And that empire has been used as a global cudgel to attack the science of climate change in the US, in Europe, in Australia, everywhere where Murdoch, where his reach extends. And most recently, he purchased the National Geographic, which was one of our great and most respected and most revered magazines about nature and science. It's many of us, as we grew up reading National Geographic. We fell in love with nature and science by reading National Geographic. Well, Murdoch owns Fox News, which is one of the major climate change denialist organizations today. And as you can see here, it's really the fox guarding the hen house when it comes to Murdoch determining the content of National Geographic. One wonders if they will continue to do the hard-hitting journalism on climate change that they have done over the years. And finally, the Koch brothers. How can we ignore the Koch brothers, who have literally spent tens of millions of dollars in their own money helping to create a global echo chamber of climate change denialism and to target politicians who aren't willing to go along with their fossil fuel agenda, even if they are Republicans. If they don't deny climate change, there's a good chance that they will be challenged in their next election by a candidate heavily funded by the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers, by the way, happen to fund this guy, Bjorn Lomborg, who calls himself the skeptical environmentalist, although he is neither. He's not skeptical. Pseudo-skepticism, denialism is not true scientific skepticism. And wearing a Greenpeace t-shirt and claiming that you were a member once of Greenpeace, which apparently Greenpeace says isn't true, does not establish your environmental bona fides and doesn't mean that when you engage in efforts to mislead the public about the threat of climate change and any number of environmental problems, that's not the work of either a skeptic or an environmentalist. Well, Bjorn Lomborg gets the better part of $1 million a year, as best we can tell from the records that have been released, from the Koch brothers for the work that he's been doing to foment climate change denialism. Okay, solutions to the problem. Well, many of the critics, like Bjorn Lomborg, I call this the sort of kinder, gentler form of denialism. People like Bjorn Lomborg or a group that calls itself the Breakthrough Institute. They claim to accept the science of climate change, although they distort it. They actually argue that the impacts won't be very bad. They tend to lowball efforts of sea level rise. They make it sound like it's a very moderate problem, that it's really just a minor annoyance, and we'll just adapt to it, and the best way to deal with it is just to continue to burn fossil fuels and grow our economy and let the free market just sort it out. Let the free market just solve the problem on its own. One of their favorite arguments is that, hey, let's just engineer the climate in a different way. We'll continue to burn those fossil fuels, and we'll continue to put CO2 into the atmosphere, but hey, we can shoot particles into the stratosphere, we can pour iron into the ocean and fertilize the algae, and we can put mirrors in space. We can go to another planet light years away. We'll figure out how to do that. But we can do all that stuff, but there's just no way we could possibly actually invest in existing technology, renewable energy technology, and scale it up. That's impossible. No way can we do that, but this stuff we could do. Well, the principle of unintended consequences reigns supreme when we talk about geoengineering. When you look into any of these schemes, what we find is that there are all sorts of potential side effects that could make us worse off than before we had even started engaging in that action. The only safe geoengineering technique, the only safe technological fix would be to design a time machine to send us back 30 years to when we should have started acting on this problem. That really leaves only one legitimate path forward, which is reducing our carbon emissions, doing something about our profligate burning of fossil fuels. We can't just wish for a climate policy, but there's a lot of progress being made in the US. President Obama has implemented a clean power plan to help get us off fossil fuel burning for power consumption. He has incentivized increases in fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, and power generation and transportation are the two biggest sectors of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So the president has targeted those two biggest sectors. The US and China engaged in an historic bilateral agreement a year ago to make substantial reductions in their carbon emissions. The two largest emitters on the planet engaging in a good faith agreement to make substantial reductions in their carbon emissions. Well, that laid the foundation for a very successful Paris summit last December, where the nations of the world, nearly 200 nations from around the world, again, came to an agreement that will cut carbon emissions, and that is they made commitments to cut carbon emissions enough that if you total up all of the commitments from Paris, it's enough to cut the projected warming in half from a business as usual warming of 5 degrees Celsius over the next century to about 3.5 degrees Celsius. That's halfway to 2 degrees Celsius, which is about as much as we think we can afford to warm the planet and not lock in potentially disastrous and irreversible changes in climate. So the Paris Agreement doesn't solve the problem, but it gets us about halfway there. It gets us onto the path toward progress, and it's possible now to envision a path forward where we do build on that agreement and we do make the reductions necessary to avoid catastrophic warming of the planet. Finally, I don't think we can underestimate the importance of people like Pope Francis lending their imprimatur, lending the moral authority that they represent to trying to refocus this problem where it needs to be focused as an issue of making sure that we do not destroy this planet for future generations, because the choices we are making now will lock in climate changes for decades and centuries down the road. If we are to prevent leaving behind a degraded planet for future generations, we literally do have to act now. That makes this next election in the United States extremely important, and we are, in the United States, we are going to have perhaps the starkest choice that we have ever had in a presidential election when it comes to the issue of climate change, because one of the two major candidates, the two major parties, has argued that we really need to solve this problem. We really need to invest in renewable energy. We need to cut our carbon emissions, the likely nominee for the Democratic Party being Hillary Clinton. And the other candidate being, of course, one of the most prominent climate change deniers today. And in fact, just today or yesterday, he came out with a new round of denialist talking points denying that climate change is real, saying not only will he renegotiate the Paris Treaty, which is what he had said weeks ago, but now he's just going to throw it out. He's just going to reject it single-handedly. Well, I don't think I am exaggerating when I say that the fate of the planet, to some extent, will rest in this next presidential election in the United States. And I certainly hope that my fellow Americans make the right choice, a choice to preserve the planet for our children and grandchildren. I'll leave it there. Thank you.